The Bayeux Tapestry is an iconic piece of English history and one of the most treasured artifacts from the early medieval period. The fact that it's so beautiful, so interesting, and so informative is a source of pride to both English and French historians, and as a sign of goodwill between these two countries, the tapestry, which is usually housed in France, is actually coming to the British Library this September. But if you look at the writing on the tapestry, you'll notice that it's not in English or in French, but in Latin, which makes sense. While the English of the 11th century had a strong literary tradition in their own language, the Normans hadn't quite gotten there yet, and they were still writing everything in Latin. This Latin is very interesting though, and not only is it an easily digestible case study on the quirks of medieval Latin, it also tells us a lot about where and by whom it was written. Today we're going to read this Latin together. I'll give a sort of running translation as we go, and I'll explain what makes this text particularly interesting. Stay tuned. Here is the Bayeux Tapestry. The website that I'm using to show it to you is the official Bayeux Museum website, where you can see the entire thing in high definition for free online. I'll have the link to that in the description. It's really so nice to live in a time where you can just look at something like this online, and I have so much gratitude to the museum staff for making this possible. As you can see, the Latin is written at the top in what are called tituli, little titles, which are basically like captions. Our first titulus is just Edward Rex, King Edward, who's sitting here talking to Harold Godwinson. After King Edward gets us started, we have a longer titulus here. Ubi Harold dux Anglorum et sui milites equitant ad Bosam. That is, where Harold, Duke of the English, and here our first medieval note, dux literally means leader in Latin, but by this point in Norman Latin, it came to mean a duke, and that's where we get the word from. Harold et sui milites, and his soldiers, equitant ad Bosham. They ride to Bosham, which is a town in West Sussex. We have a small titulus here, ecclesia, describing this church, which is probably supposed to be the church at Bosham. Further on, we have hic Harold mare navigavit. Here Harold sails the sea. The titulus continues, et velis vento plenis venit in terra vidonis comitis. And with sails full, vento by wind, venit, he came, in terra vidonis comitis, in the land of Guido the comes. And comes in Latin kind of means like a comrade or a soldier, but here in Norman Latin it definitely means count, and that's where we get the word count from. So Count Guido is the name of the guy whose land Harold Godwinson comes into. Following that text, we get a couple beautiful pictures of boats with a little titulus here, Harold, depicting Harold himself. But once Harold arrives in the land of Count Guido, we get hic apprehendit Guido Haroldum. Here, Guido seized Harold. And this is a scribal abbreviation. Grammatically, we have here Haroldum, accusative, because Harold is the one being seized. But they didn't feel like writing the M, so they added this little dash here in the U. After Guido seizes Harold, we get et duxit eum ad Belrem, and he led him to Beaurain, et ibi eum tenuit, and held him there. The next titulus, capturing Harold's conversation with Guido, is really interesting. Ubi Harold et Guido parabolant. The first thing to notice is this 7 right here. This means et, or and. It's a really common scribal convention, especially in early medieval England, and we see it all the time in Old English texts as an abbreviation for ond. The sentence means, where Harold and Guido talk. But the word for talk is really strange. Parabolo in classical Latin means to talk in sort of metaphors. It's where we get the word parable from, but it's also where French gets the word parler from. So whoever was dictating the Latin for this tapestry was probably a Norman who either didn't know or forgot that the way to say this in Latin is probably just colocuntur. They fell back on their French and gave parabolant. But moving on, we have ubi nuntii Wilhelmi ducis venerunt ad Guidone. That is, where the messengers of Duke William came to Guido. And here we have a titulus Turold, identifying this man as Turold. Another one here, nuntii Wilhelmi, identify these men as the messengers of William. Here we get another really interesting feature. Hic venit nuntius ad Willielmum ducem. Here came the messenger to William the Duke. but look at the way that William is spelled. Wil-yelmum. This G right here is serving as a y sound, which makes sense for how the name was pronounced. But in most places at this time, a G before an E in Latin probably makes the j sound, except in Old English, where it makes the y sound. So, whoever decided how this passage was going to be spelled was a very literate Old English speaker who knew that the sound y was spelled ge, thus Willielmum. Moving on, we have the same feature again. Hic vido adduxit Haroldum ad Willielmum Normanorum ducem. That is, here Guido brings Harold to William, the Duke of the Normans. In the next scene, we have Hic dux Willielm cum Haroldo venit ad palatium suum. Here Duke William, with Harold, comes to his palace. And here we have sort of proto-tildes above these U's, demonstrating the omitted M. Here we get to a somewhat controversial titulus. Ubi unus clericus et alfieva, where one cleric and alfieva do something. And what that is, we are not told. The verb has been omitted here. There's been a lot of speculation as to what they're doing. A lot of people think that it's romantic in nature. Some people don't. But I'll just focus on the orthography here. Alfieva. Here we have an ash for the a sound and a g for the y sound. Two smoking guns that this was clearly designed by someone who was literate in the Old English tradition, either a priest or a bishop who was dictating how it should be spelled, or the probably women who were embroidering it themselves. I realized while editing that I actually skipped the next scene, but here it is. Hic Wilhelm dux et exercitus eius venerunt ad montem Michaelis. Here William the Duke and his army came to the mountain of Michael, that is, the mountain of Saint Michael, Mont Saint-Michel. And here we have again a sort of proto-tilde indicating an omitted M in the accusative montem. The next scene has a couple tituli. Et hic transierunt flumen Cosnonis. And here they crossed the river Cosnonis, and this in French is Coinon, sorry for my bad pronunciation. We get a really heroic looking herald here, and the caption tells us, Hic Harold Dux trahebat eos de arena. Here Harold the Duke dragged them from the sand, that is, dragging them out of the sand of the riverbank, referring to the perilous crossing at Coinon. Luckily, he makes it out in one piece, and the next scene reads, Et venerunt ad Dole, and they came to Dole, which is a town in Brittany. The next caption reads, Et Conan fuga vertit, and Conan, who was the Duke of Brittany, fuga vertit, turned in flight. Here we have a small titulus rednes, which is Ren, and then we get to some real fighting. Hic milites Wilhelmi ducis, here the soldiers of Duke William, pugnant contra, they fight against Dinantes, the people of Dinan. Et Conan claves porrexit, and Conan stretched out the keys, and we can actually see him here stretching out the keys on a lance, that is, surrendering the city. Hic Wilhelm dedit Haroldo arma. Here William gave Harold arms, and that is weapons and armor. And then we get an interesting mistake. He Wilhelm venit Bayas, but this he is obviously supposed to be hic. Here William came to Bayeux. Now the spelling of Bayeux with the G making the y sound is another good piece of evidence that this was made by people who come from the Old English literary tradition. But this word being spelled as H-I-E, in my opinion, is also a great piece of evidence. Because he, spelled H-I-E, is not a word in Latin, but it is a word in Old English. It's a very common word, meaning they. So if you were a monk or nun used to writing in Old English, H-I-E as a series of 3 letters is very common. You would write that all the time. And you might just have muscle memory at this point, once you get to the H-I, to just write E next. And that's what I think happened here. This word was supposed to be hic, and someone accidentally wrote the Old English word for they, he. Next we get to another somewhat controversial scene. Ubi Harold sacramentum fecit Wilhelmo duci, where Harold made a sacramentum, an oath, to William the Duke. This next titulus is really stretched out. Hic Harold dux, here Harold the Duke, reversus est, returned, ad Anglicam terram, to English land, et venit ad Edwardum and came to Edward regem, the king. We have now arrived to King Edward's death, and out of order chronologically because we're going to see his funeral here and then we're going to see his death in the next scene. But the titulus reads, Hic portatur corpus Edwardi regis. Here, the body of King Edward is carried ad ecclesiam sancti Petri apostoli, to the church of Saint Peter the Apostle. And here we have some tildes above these words, indicating quite a few omitted letters. This is very common in common words, like sancti, saint, and apostoli, apostle. Here we get two tituli accompanying two scenes. Hic Edwardus Rex in lecto alloquitor fideles. Here, Edward the King, in his bed, talks to his fideles, to his trusted people. And then on the bottom, et hic defunctus est, and here he died. As we can see, the deponent ending of alloquitor has been obliterated as well, with just this little symbol here to demonstrate that there's missing letters. Here is Harold's great sin. Hic dederunt Haroldo coronam regis. Here they gave to Harold the crown of the king. And then here, hic residet Harold rex Anglorum. Here sits Harold, the king of the English. Here we have Stigant, the archiepiscopus, the archbishop. And this word episcopus, bishop, has been shortened to three letters, EPS, with a tilde above, to show the shortening. Here we have what might be a mistake. Isti mirantur stellam. These people, isti, wonder at the star, which is of course Halley's comet. The problem is that mirur, to wonder, is a deponent verb, and you really need to have UR right here. Several deponent verbs so far have omitted this, but they've also included something to demonstrate that there is an omission. This one doesn't have that, so either they forgot to put it in, or it's a genuine grammatical mistake. I would probably guess it's the former, but we don't know. This titulus just reads Harold, and here he is. Next we come to another drawn-out titulus, Hic navis Anglica. Here, an English boat, venit in terram Wilhelmi ducis, came into the land of William the Duke. And in response probably to being told that Harold has broken his promise and taken the throne for himself, we get Hic Wilhelm Dux iusit naves aedificare. Here, Duke William commanded to build boats, that is, commanded to build a fleet. Then we get some really great images of boat building itself. Then we get Hic trahuntur naves ad mare. Here, the boats are dragged to the sea. Isti portant armas ad naves, et hic trahunt carrum cum vino et armis. Isti, these people, portant armas, they carry arms, ad naves, to the boats. Et hic, and here, trahunt carrum, they carry a cart, cum vino et armis, with wine and weapons. Then we get Hic Wilhelm Dux in magno navigio. Here, Duke William, in a great boat, mare, the sea, transivit, crossed. So he crossed the sea in a great boat. Et venit ad Pevenisa, and came to Pevensey. Pevensey being a town in East Sussex, the Old English name Pevenisa probably means Pevens River. Accompanying this scene is Hic exeunt caballi de navibus. Here, the horses leave from the boats. And using caballi to mean horses isn't wrong, but it's a pretty rare word in classical Latin, and we'd expect to see equi here. But the word for horse in French is cheval from caballus. So if you're in the moment and you forget that equus is the Latin word for horse, you can fall back on your French and get caballus, which is a rare word for horse, but does still mean horse. Getting away from the boats, we have et hic milites festinaverunt Hastinga. And here the soldiers hurried to Hastings. Ut cibum raperentur, so that they could carry off food. Raperentur here is deponent for some reason. This is probably an actual grammatical mistake, unless it's some sort of obscure function that I'm not aware of, but it really should be raperent here. We are told hic est wadard. This is watered. Next, hic coquitur caro. Here, meat is being cooked. Then at the feast, et hic ministraverunt ministri, and here the servants served. Fecerunt prandium, here they made dinner. And then et hic episcopus cibum et potum benedicit. And here the bishop blesses the food and the drink. We get a picture of William at the feast. Wilhelm. Here's Odo Episcopus, bishop again being shortened here. And then Rotbert, Robert. Then iste iusit ut foderetur castellum. Iste, this guy, iusit, commanded, ut foderetur castellum, that fortifications be built. And then we get a really big mistake, which is really cool to see, because where in Latin it should say ad Hastingae castra, we get Old English at Hastinga castra, at the castle of Hastings. So again, this is almost definitely written by a native Old English speaker who saw the Latin ad Hastingae castra and wrote implicitly the Old English translation of that phrase. Moving on, we have hic nuntiatum est Wilhelmo de Harold. Here, it is announced to William about Harold, that is, that Harold is coming. I really like that the dative O in Wilhelmo has here been reduced to a tiny little circle in between the crests of the M, and they didn't even bother adding one for Harold. Next, hic domus incenditur. Here, a house is being burned. Hic milites exierunt de Hastinga. Here, the soldiers leave from Hastings. And then we get a really grand scene. Et venerunt, and they came. Ad proilium, to the battle. And here the OE has just been written as E. AE, OE, and E were often confused in medieval Latin. Contra Haroldum regem. Against Harold the king. Here we get a very drawn out titulus. Wilhelm dux interrogat Vital. William, the duke, asks Vital, si vidicet exercitum Haroldi, if he saw the army of Harold. This is not a grammatical mistake, but it is definitely a mistake, and another sign that this is influenced by French, because you can't say he asked him si vidicet, it's an vidicet or utrum vidicet. Si vidicet is possible in French, but not in Latin. It's also kind of an infelicity in Old English to use the equivalent word if in these clauses. We would prefer whether, which is why in modern English it's most natural to say he asked him whether or not he saw the army. So it's not certain, but this almost definitely was dictated by a French speaker who was used to saying si in this instance. Then on the other side of the battlefield, iste nuntiat Haroldum regem de exercitu Wilhelmi ducis. This guy, probably this one right here, nuntiat Haroldum regem, tells Harold the king, de exercitu Wilhelmi ducis, about the army of William the Duke. Then we get William's speech. Hic Wilhelm dux alloquitur suis militibus. Here, William the Duke talks to his soldiers. And what does he tell them? Well, it says it here. Ut praeparent se, that they prepare themselves, so he tells them to prepare themselves, viriliter, like men, et sapienter, and wisely, ad proilium, to the battle. So they should prepare themselves manfully and wisely for the battle. The battle against whom? Contra Anglorum exercitum, against the army of the English. After a lot of fighting, we get a really drawn-out titulus. Hic ceciderunt, here they fell, Lewine et Jurth, Leofwine and Jurth, fratres Haroldi regis, brothers of Harold the king. The battle continues, and we get hic ceciderunt, here they fell, simul Angli et Franci in proilio, at the same time English and French in battle. So the English and the French fell at the same time in battle. The fact that the Normans are called Franci here is definitely a sign of English influence in the Latin, as the Normans probably would never have called themselves French. That is, they had a very strong rivalry already with the French proper, and they would have called themselves Normans, but the English don't really see the difference there and just called them all French. Around this point in the battle, we are told from multiple sources that a rumor began to spread that William was dead. To combat this rumor, we have hic odo episcopus baculum tenens confortat pueros. That is, here Odo the bishop, Odo being of course William's brother, baculum tenens, holding a baculum, a staff, confortat pueros, which literally means he strengthens the boys, but we can understand that to mean he sort of comforts the soldiers. He gives them assuring words that William is not dead, and to prove it, William takes his helmet off. Hic est Wilhelm dux. Here is William the Duke, here with his helmet off. The battle rages on, and we get hic Franci pugnant, here the French fight, et ceciderunt, and they fell. Who fell? Qui erant cum Haroldo, those who were with Harold. And then, finally, we get our last real line from the tapestry. Hic Harold rex interfectus est. Here, Harold the king is killed. Harold famously got shot in the eye with an arrow, and there's been a lot of controversy over whether or not this is him with an arrow in his eye, because this arrow has been recently added. But the holes which the arrow is stitched into are actually originals, so there was at least something here. What it is we might not ever really know, but I personally am of the opinion that in the original embroidery this was actually an arrow, and that Harold maybe actually was shot in the eye with an arrow, or at least the legend had already begun to circulate by this time. For the sake of covering it, we'll read this last line, but just know this is almost definitely not part of the original tapestry, and likely added later in a restoration attempt. Et fuga verterunt Angli, and the English turned in flight. That's the Bayeux Tapestry. Let me know in the comments what you thought. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like videos like this, be sure to check out the rest of the channel. Kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon. And until next time, Farathye Yesunde.